On August 13, 2018, the quiet, suburban routine of Frederick, Colorado, was abruptly interrupted by news that would quickly escalate into a national tragedy. Shannon Watts, 34, and her two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, had vanished from their home, leaving no trace or signs of forced entry. Shannon was also 15 weeks pregnant with a boy, Nico, which elevated the case to a scenario of a triple disappearance with an unborn victim. The initial report was filed by her friend and colleague, Nicole Atkinson, who became concerned after receiving no response and realizing Shannon had missed a crucial medical appointment that morning. Attention immediately focused on the only adult present, Chris Watts, the husband and father, an oil-field worker who, to the public eye, appeared utterly devastated. Facing a deluge of television cameras, Chris Watts presented himself at his front door to plead for his family's return. His appearance quickly became a moment of psychological and media analysis. Chris spoke with a serenity and control that clashed jarringly with the expected image of a desperate husband and father. Wearing a clean gray t-shirt and with his arms crossed over his chest, his voice was unusually measured, almost monotone. He addressed the entire nation with prepared phrases. "I just want them to come home, to be safe. If someone asks them, please bring them back." The tears, the hysteria, the emotional disarray typical of genuine anguish were absent. These images played on a loop across all US news channels. For the vast majority of viewers, Chris Watts embodied the portrait of the ideal husband and father facing an incomprehensible tragedy. However, for FBI investigators and behavioral experts observing the footage, alarm bells began to sound. They immediately detected a series of rehearsed gestures and a profound lack of genuine emotion. His gaze was unnaturally fixed, his blinking irregular, and the rigidity of his body suggested internal containment rather than pain. Analysts noted that his words were superficial, lacking the emotional depth one would expect when mentioning his two small daughters. While the cameras captured the facade of the man asking for help, the police were working discreetly behind the scenes. Detectives, trained in the Reed interrogation technique, were already using his anomalous composure as a key piece of evidence to dismantle the Watts' perfect facade. Police operated under the immediate hypothesis that the perpetrator was not a stranger, but someone close. The suspicion of a husband acting with such composure after the disappearance of his pregnant wife and two daughters is, statistically, the most probable. No one imagined that serene face, almost arrogant in its control, hid the truth of one of the most atrocious and calculated betrayals in recent American family crime history, an act of pure selfishness aimed at erasing his entire family. Chris and Shannon Watts had meticulously constructed a life that, from the outside, was the epitome of the American dream. They owned a spacious, 5-bedroom house in the quiet Saratoga Trail neighborhood of Frederick, Colorado. They had two adorable daughters and a dog. Shannon, an energetic and influential figure on social media, was the main architect of this public image. Through her direct sales job selling wellness products, Shannon shared every detail of their life on Facebook and other platforms, showcasing a home filled with love, laughter, luxury trips, and financial success. It was the digital portrait of modern, unwavering happiness, a constant curation of family perfection. Nevertheless, this perfection was a hollow shell concealing deep cracks. 3 years earlier, in 2015, the couple had filed for bankruptcy, burdened by considerable debts and financial pressure that never truly disappeared. This financial strain, combined with the power dynamic in the marriage, Shannon being the dominant, organized figure, and Chris, the passive, silent husband, contributed to the slow deterioration of the relationship. Shannon, devoted to her sales career and her daughters, traveled frequently, trusting her husband to keep the home in order. But Chris, reserved and feeling increasingly distant and suffocated by responsibilities he hadn't chosen, had begun searching for an escape valve. That escape valve materialized in the summer of 2018 as a double life. Chris began a clandestine relationship with a coworker, Nicole Kessinger. What started as a simple affair quickly transformed into a fantasy of absolute freedom. Chris systematically lied to Nicole, assuring her he was already divorcing, that his marriage was over, and that he had no intention of returning. In his mind, Chris began to project a life free of the weight of debt, free of the demanding wife, and free of the children he now perceived as obstacles to his new identity. This selfish desire to start from scratch became the sole motive for the crime. While Shannon was traveling, posting messages of love and hope for Chris and seeking couples therapy to fix their marriage, Chris was sinking deeper into the lie and the planning of his new life. The contrast between the public image of the happy family and the private reality of a man who wanted to eliminate his past became the key to understanding the imminent crime. The gap between the ideal and the reality was insurmountable. For Chris, the only way to achieve his freedom was by physically erasing every trace of his family. The fatal sequence was set in motion during the early hours of Monday, August 13, 2018. Shannon Watts returned home to Frederick after a 4-day business trip to Arizona. Her friend, Nicole Atkinson, dropped her off at the front door at 1:48 de la mañana. The home's doorbell camera captured the last confirmed image of Shannon, dragging her suitcase inside. It was the last time anyone would see her alive. The morning unfolded without apparent incident until her friend, Nicole, grew worried. Shannon wasn't responding to calls or texts, which was completely unusual for such a digitally active woman. The alarm escalated when Shannon, who was extremely punctual and meticulous about her health due to her pregnancy, missed a crucial medical appointment that morning. At approximately 12:10 del día, Nicole Atkinson and a police officer arrived at the Watts residence. They found Shannon's car parked in the garage. The front door was locked, and despite insistent knocking, no one answered. Police contacted Chris Watts at his workplace at Anadarko Petroleum to have him return home immediately. Upon arrival, Chris used a key he conveniently had with him, allowing officers entry. The interior scene was unsettling. The house appeared untouched, but Shannon and the girls were gone. Agents found essential belongings on the kitchen table and in the living room, including her wallet, keys, and Shannon's cell phone. Two detectives, a devoted mother and businesswoman so dependent on communication would never voluntarily leave her phone and keys behind, much less miss a vital doctor's appointment. Chris's behavior in the house was immediately flagged as suspicious by the officers. As he moved through the living room, kitchen, and bedrooms, he maintained an excessive calm that sharply contrasted with the situation of a triple disappearance. He opened doors, offered vague theories, and repeatedly claimed he didn't understand what could have happened. Agents noted his complete inability to show authentic concern for his daughter's safety. Faced with evidence of an anomalous disappearance, the focus shifted to the neighborhood security cameras. The key recording came from neighbor Nathan Trujillo's camera. The video captured Chris's activity that morning. At 5:27 de la mañana, Chris was recorded moving his work truck, a white Ford F-250 from Anadarko, and loading what appeared to be bulky, heavy bundles into the back. Chris claimed he was just loading his work tools for an unusually early start. However, investigators observed that the vehicle looked unusually low, suggesting a considerable load. The footage showed him entering and exiting the house 3 times with atypical urgency and physical rigidity. To detectives, the tools alibi was untenable, and they quickly concluded that what Chris had transported under the dim light of dawn was the physical evidence of his crime, the bodies of his wife and 2 daughters. The case had shifted from a disturbing disappearance to a founded suspicion of homicide, and Chris Watts, the husband who appeared so calm, became the primary and sole suspect. On August 14, less than 48 hours after the false missing person alarm, Chris Watts presented himself voluntarily at the police station for a formal interview. His primary goal was control, to maintain the alibi of innocence he had presented to the media and to establish a timeline that would clear him of guilt. However, inside the sterile interrogation room, Watts was confronted by 2 of the sharpest professionals in law enforcement, Detective Tammy Lee of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and Agent Graham Coder of the FBI. The detectives were not looking for information, they were looking for a confession, using advanced psychological techniques designed to exploit flaws in his narrative and body language. During the first few hours, Chris maintained a rigidly controlled posture and a monotone voice. The detectives watched closely. His breathing pattern was shallow and controlled, a clinical sign of massive internal tension. They noted his restricted vocabulary and his inability to articulate grief, limiting himself to logistical descriptions of the house. Chris avoided prolonged eye contact, and his hands remained crossed, a physical wall reflecting his emotional barrier. The detectives used the rapport-building technique, acting as if they believed his story to make him feel safe, but they knew the only way to break through was with science. The dramatic turning point came with the polygraph test. Chris, with a fatal arrogance born of his emotional detachment, naively believed his calm exterior could trick the lie detector. The results, however, were immediate and categorical. When asked if he knew where his family was or if he had harmed them, Chris showed dramatic physiological reactivity, with massive spikes in skin conductivity, heart rate, and breathing. His body, even as he tried to control it, was screaming the truth. The agents capitalized on his failure. They showed him the polygraph readings and explained that his body had betrayed his deception. This confrontation was crucial. By forcing him to face the betrayal of his own physiology, they stripped Chris of his last psychological defense, the belief that he could control others' perception. The strategy shifted to minimization, a technique suggesting lesser motives to make the suspect view confession as relief and mitigation of guilt. Detective L., in a moment of tactical brilliance, delivered the final blow by appealing directly to Chris's suppressed conscience. Setting aside the evidence, she asked softly but firmly, "Chris, what do you think Shannon would tell us if we could ask her what really happened in that bedroom?" It was a direct moral confrontation, forcing him to visualize the wife he had murdered. The long silence that followed, over a minute of internal agony, marked the moment his story became unsustainable. His posture collapsed, his breathing turned erratic, and his mask of calm visibly broke, opening a window toward guilt and leading to his first, and entirely false, confession. In a desperate attempt to mitigate his crime, Chris fabricated an implausible story. He alleged that Shannon had murdered the girls, and that he strangled her in a fit of rage to avenge his daughters. This lie, however, only confirmed to the detectives that he was solely responsible. With the failure of the polygraph test and Chris's erratic behavior during interrogation, CBI and FBI agents dismissed the disappearance narrative and focused on the triple homicide hypothesis. Suspicion had solidified into conviction. The investigators' priority was to reconstruct Chris's timeline from the early hours of August 13, using technology to systematically refute his claims. The inconsistencies in his account were numerous and clear. Chris had claimed to have left home at a certain time, but his work drug records and his neighbor's testimony contradicted him. The team focused on analyzing his digital life. A search warrant for his electronic devices revealed a desperate attempt to erase the trail of his double life. Chris had been performing disturbing online searches, including quick divorce in Colorado, and queries about lethal substances and body disposal. This was irrefutable proof of premeditation, demolishing any claim of a crime of passion. He had deleted text messages and chats, but investigators recovered them from cloud backups. While digital analysis dismantled his alibi, investigators gathered testimony from those around him. Neighbor Nicole Atkinson, who had first raised the alarm, told agents, "I've never seen Chris act like that. He's nervous, different, he won't look you in the eye." This observation of a radical change in his behavior validated the body language experts' assessments. The police increased the pressure. The crucial physical evidence that closed the net came from the geolocation of his phone. Satellite tracking showed his phone had registered anomalous activity in a remote location on the morning of August 13, the Anadarko oil field in Weld County, an area he knew well. This activity occurred immediately after the time his neighbor's camera recorded him loading bundles into his truck. The coincidence was impossible to refute. Investigators knew the house was the crime scene, and the oil field the disposal site. Chris's double life, his plan to start anew with his lover, Nicole Kessinger, completely fell apart in the face of technological evidence. Messages between them revealed detailed future plans, painting the picture of a man ready to erase his family to live freely. The truth, inevitable and imminent, was closing in with every new piece of evidence confirming the cold calculation behind his crime. While Chris Watts tried to maintain his facade of innocence, claiming his wife and daughters had left voluntarily, police returned to the neighborhood for an exhaustive review of security footage. The most incriminating footage came from his neighbor, Nathan Trujillo. The garage camera had recorded Chris's activity that morning, acting as a silent witness. Nicole Atkinson and her husband, Nathan Trujillo, showed investigators the video that changed everything. At 5:27 de la mañana, Chris moved his white work truck toward the garage, a completely unnecessary action for his supposed routine. The camera captured 3 tense, hurried trips between the garage and the truck bed, each time loading bulky, heavy bundles. The investigators immediately realized these were not tools, but the bodies of Shannon, Bella, and Celeste. The most disturbing confirmation came from the neighbor's testimony. They described Chris as usually calm and slow, never rushing. "We've never seen him act like that," one said. "He was nervous, moving fast, almost stumbling over himself." This drastic behavioral change during the crime's time frame was devastating circumstantial evidence. Chris had also spent unusual time cleaning the truck bed before and after the disappearance, an obvious attempt to destroy biological evidence. agents chose direct confrontation. They brought Chris back to the neighborhood and showed him the footage in front of Trujillo's camera. Trying to maintain composure, he watched with his arms crossed defensively, offering weak excuses about extra time loading his gear. But when the video ended, his discomfort was unmistakable. As soon as he left the neighbor's house, Nicole Atkinson turned to the police and said, "Something is wrong with him. He's lying." That statement became one of the first public certainties of the case. The footage and testimony not only shattered his alibi but provided the route and method of disposal, closing the circle of evidence and leading directly to his pressure from the police, who now had his phone's geolocation, the incriminating neighbor's video, the filed polygraph, and his mistress's testimony. Chris Watts was led back to the interrogation room. The evidence had accumulated to the point of being irrefutable. Inconsistencies in his account were massive, and the digital evidence proved his planning. The detectives, knowing they had the truth but needing the location of the bodies, completely changed their strategy. The goal was no longer to find the truth, but to give Chris a psychological escape route to confess. When the agents showed him the text message history with his mistress, Nicole Kessinger, his expression radically changed. The fantasy of freedom he had built collapsed before his eyes. Instead of confronting him with the evil of his actions, Detective Tammy Lee and Agent Coder offered an out based on the minimization of the crime. "We know something happened, Chris. Sometimes people make mistakes. Did Shannon do something to you? Did you lose control? Was it a moment of madness?" This was a psychological tactic designed to allow Chris to save face and mitigate his sentence, suggesting that the fault could be shared or that the victim had been the provocateur. The tactic partially worked. Between forced tears and ragged breathing, an act that still seemed devoid of genuine grief but showed a break in his control, Chris Watts finally broke his silence. He uttered his first and elaborately false confession. He claimed they had killed Shannon, but only after having seen her on the security cameras asphyxiating their two daughters, Bella and Celeste. According to his account, he had entered the room at that moment and, in a fit of rage and despair, had strangled Shannon to stop her and avenge his daughters. He tried to describe this fictitious scenario in detail, seeking to present himself as a tragic hero who had acted in defense of his girls. However, the agents were not fooled. His story did not align with the preliminary forensic analysis of the house, the timeline's logic, or the lack of defensive wounds on Shannon. The detectives confronted him with reality. They asked him why, if Shannon had killed the girls, he had loaded all three bodies into his truck and driven them to the oil field. They asked him why he hadn't called 911 or attempted to revive his daughters if he had supposedly found them alive. The pressure escalated when confronting the lack of emotion when discussing Shannon and the convenience of the lie. The police knew it was impossible for Shannon to have overpowered and suffocated both her daughters simultaneously, especially while pregnant. The truth broke through. Chris's lie only served to demonstrate his narcissism and his desperation to mitigate his sentence. His confession marked the point of no return, revealing the true face of the calculating killer who had played with the empathy of an entire country. Following the collapse of his first lie, investigators pressed Chris Watts for the raw, real details of what happened in the early morning of August 13. Once the truth began to leak out, his lies crumbled one after another, exposing a premeditation and coldness that chilled even veteran detectives. Chris finally agreed to recount the complete timeline and the true motive for the crimes. Shannon returned from her business trip at 1:48 de la mañana, exhausted and vulnerable. Immediately, a tense argument occurred in the couple's bedroom. She had confronted Chris about his distant behavior and demanded the truth about his affair, sensing the betrayal. She spoke to him about her pregnancy and the baby Nico as a last hope to save their marriage. Chris, however, was already completely immersed in his new life and fantasy of freedom with Nicole Kessinger. To him, Shannon and his children had become obstacles that needed to be eliminated. Instead of facing divorce and the financial responsibilities it would entail, Chris made the irreversible and definitive decision. He strangled her in bed, suffocating her life with his own hands. The act of filicide was consummated after his wife's strangulation. Chris went to his daughter's rooms. The most horrifying aspect is that Bella and Celeste were still alive when he manipulated them. Chris loaded Shannon's lifeless body and his two small daughters, carrying them out of the house. He put them in the back of his work truck, the Ford F-250. The drive that followed was about 40 miles, a journey he made in the dark, with his wife and his two living daughters in the back, to the Anadarko petroleum oil field in Weld County. Amidst the silence and loneliness of the dawn, Chris consummated the final phase of his macabre plan. First, E disposed of Shannon's body, burying her in a shallow grave near one of the oil tank batteries. Then, E performed the most sadistic act of all, E murdered his two daughters. E forced Bella and Celeste up the narrow stairs of two crude oil tanks and threw them, still alive, through the small upper opening to drown them in the crude oil. The confession revealed chilling details. The girls may have struggled or fought as they were being inserted. The coldness with which E described every step of the disposal, from the strangulation to the closing of the tank hatches, chilled investigators. There was not a trace of remorse, only the need to close the circle of his lie and his selfishness to start his so-called free life. The recovery of the bodies of Shannon, Bella, and Celeste at the Anadarko petroleum oil field was an extremely complex and disturbing operation for the forensic teams. The remote and contaminated site required specialized equipment to drain and ventilate the toxic crude oil from the storage tanks where Chris had drowned his daughters. The nature of the disposal demonstrated his premeditated attempt to conceal and accelerate decomposition, hoping the bodies would never be found or would be unrecognizable. Once recovered, the bodies were taken for forensic examination. The autopsy report became the most damning document in the case. The findings confirmed the methodical brutality of the crime and shattered Chris's attempt to blame Shannon. The report revealed that Shannon Watts had died from manual strangulation, consistent with a death inflicted by Chris. The absence of significant defensive injuries suggested she was attacked while asleep or in a state of extreme vulnerability. The most heartbreaking findings came from the examination of Bella and Celeste. The autopsy confirmed that both girls died from asphyxia and suffocation. The toxicological tests revealed an unequivocal concentration of crude oil in their lungs, stomachs, and airways. This devastating discovery proved beyond doubt that the girls were alive and conscious when they were forced into the tanks and died from drowning in the toxic crude. The fact that they had inhaled and swallowed the liquid proved that their hearts were still beating. This forensic finding eliminated any doubt regarding Chris Watts' sole culpability and completely refuted his lie that Shannon had murdered them. If Shannon had suffocated them at home, they would not have had oil in their lungs. Additionally, minor bruises and injuries were found on Bella's body, suggesting that the girl may have fought for her life. The scientific evidence stood as the definitive witness, confirming that Chris had acted with coldness and calculation to eliminate his family. The weight of this evidence made the prosecutor completely certain of securing a conviction, even without Chris Watts proceeded with unusual speed, given the overwhelming and irrefutable forensic and technological evidence. On November 6, 2018, barely 3 months after the triple homicide, Chris Watts was brought before the Weld County Courthouse. Instead of undergoing a long, costly, and highly publicized trial, Watts, advised by his attorneys, pleaded guilty to all charges, including 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of tampering with a deceased body. This plea was part of a negotiated agreement with the prosecution to avoid the death penalty. The decision not to seek capital punishment came from a direct and heartbreaking plea from Shannon's parents, the Versuchek family. They desperately wished to avoid a lengthy trial that would prolong their agony and force them to relive the horrific details of the murders. For them, justice meant the certainty that Watts would never leave prison. A guaranteed life sentence was preferable to the uncertainty of a capital trial. The prosecution honored the request, ensuring that Watts would spend the rest of his days in isolation. During the sentencing hearing, the court focused on victim impact statements. The atmosphere was heavy with grief and tension. Frank Versuchek, Shannon's father, read a moving statement, confronting Chris directly about the horror, betrayal, and manipulation. His voice trembled with emotion as he expressed his deep regret for ever trusting Chris with the lives of his daughter and granddaughters. Shannon's mother, Cindy Watts, also spoke, describing her daughter's kindness and the incomprehensible cruelty of the act. The district attorney presented the facts with chilling precision, emphasizing the motive behind the crime, Chris's pure selfishness. He saw his family as an obstacle to his new life and destroyed 5 lives to gain his freedom. The judge, in delivering the sentence, condemned Watts' actions in severe terms, calling the murders the most monstrous, cruel, and inhuman crime imaginable. He declared that Chris Watts did not deserve to be part of society or to hope for redemption. Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In addition, 48 years were added for tampering with the bodies and unlawful termination of a pregnancy, along with 36 years for 3 counts of tampering with human remains. The sentence guaranteed that Christopher Watts would spend every remaining day of his life confined in a maximum security prison. Following his sentencing, Chris Watts was classified as a high-profile inmate. To ensure his safety and avoid attacks from other inmates seeking vigilante justice, Watts was transferred to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin. His life became one of monotony, isolation, and constant surveillance. He spends most of his time in his cell, reading or engaging in solitary activities. Ironically, the man who killed his family to gain freedom now lives in the most controlled environment imaginable, condemned to perpetual solitude. While in prison, Watts became the focus of a disturbing sociological phenomenon known as hybristophilia, attraction to notorious criminals. He began receiving hundreds of letters from female admirers who professed love or fascination for him despite his horrific crimes. These letters, filled with sympathy and support, demonstrated the dark allure of media-driven criminals and caused public outrage. The idea that a confessed murderer of his own children could be idolized added another macabre layer to the case. The real post-conviction drama came in 2019, when Chris agreed to a second, non-mandatory interview with agents Tammy Lee and Graham Coder. He claimed they wanted to cleanse his soul and find redemption through religion. But many analysts suggested his true motive was narcissism, the desire to control the final narrative of his story. In this late confession, Watts admitted to lying not only about the cause of death but also about the disposal process. Chris revealed that Bella and Celeste were conscious and awake in the truck. He admitted that during the 40-mile drive to the oil field, his daughters had woken up. The most chilling detail was his recollection of Bella asking in a terrified voice, "What is happening to mommy?" He confessed that Bella saw him loading her mother's body and possibly witnessed him strangling Celeste before throwing her into the crude oil. These revelations did not alter his sentence but exposed the full depth of his cruelty and awareness. Today, Chris lives confined, supposedly repentant, though his actions reveal only selfishness and profound emotional detachment. The Watts case was not simply a crime, it became a cultural and sociological phenomenon. It exposed the deep darkness that can hide behind the polished facade of social media perfection. Shannon Watts' life, meticulously documented through happy posts and loving messages, stood in painful contrast to the reality of a broken marriage and emotional betrayal. The story became a brutal warning about the illusion of digital happiness. Social media, created to share joy, can become a stage for hiding domestic dysfunction and despair. The contrast between the smiling photos and the cold reality of murder served as a stark reminder that appearances deceive. Chris Watts exploited this facade until the very end, using the image of a perfect family to manipulate public sympathy, making his confession even more shocking. Driven by narcissism and selfishness, Chris Watts sought to start over without the burden of his family. He became the modern face of betrayal, a man who chose personal freedom over love, duty, and life itself. The case sparked widespread analysis of the psychology of filicide, where a parent sees their family not as a treasure, but as an obstacle to be eliminated. This crime not only shook Colorado but became a landmark in true crime history. The availability of interrogation tapes, text messages, and Shannon's social posts gave the world an intimate, horrifying view of the events. The story of Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico remains a painful reminder that evil can live within the most trusted place, the home. It stands as a dark mirror of deception, manipulation, and human coldness, a warning for the digital age that perfection online can hide unimaginable horror.
If you liked this video, subscribe to the channel, activate the little bell, and give it a like. This way, you will help more people discover the story behind every mystery.
Barcelona. We always think of it as the city of sunshine, but this case revealed tremendous darkness in 2017. It was a crime of passion that uncovered a web of lies and betrayal right at the heart of the Guardia Urbana, Barcelona's local police force. Everything revolves around an explosive love triangle. You have two officers, Rosa and Albert, and the victim, Pedro. A relationship completely marked by jealousy, obsession, and broken rules within the police force. Rosa's dream of starting a new life turned into an absolute nightmare of jealousy. And everything explodes when the burnt body of a man is found inside a car in the Foix reservoir, the Pantano de Foix. The investigation, inevitably, points straight to the Guardia Urbana headquarters. Rosa and Albert desperately tried to create a perfect alibi, blaming each other again and again to escape justice. The key question here is: was this a crime of passion that got out of hand? Or are we talking about a coldly planned execution? In the next episode, we'll dismantle that facade of the law to reveal the pact of silence that shocked all of Spain. You can't miss this case. Subscribe now so you don't miss any detail of the urban guard crime, El Crimen de la Guardia Urbana. We'll have it for you very soon.